All right. Welcome, everyone, to National Park Service Presents. This is one of my favorite programs of all time that we've been running. I know, not supposed to be saying that, but you know what? I've said it every week, and why stop now? This has been running every other Tuesday at 6 p.m. entirely online. And we will run this all the way through the end of April, which actually is just next month. At the end of, I believe, April 26th is our very last one. The series covers a multitude of topics. Honestly, they've had great titles, but this title is by far my favorite one. I am so excited. But before we, I'm going to go over boring Zoom features, okay? We are recording. So if you need to leave a bit early, even though please don't, or would be sad, or if you wanted to catch up on last week's or anything, everything goes up on YouTube. So you can catch up on the series or past ones on the BPL YouTube page. The best way to do it is honestly to look for, or just Google Boston Public Library YouTube, and you will see it right there. You'll notice we have captions on. If you do not enjoy them, you can always turn the captions off yourself. It means you'll click on the CC button at the bottom and hit, I believe it says hide subtitles, and you can turn those off. We strongly recommend any and all questions and any and all chatting. We really, really enjoy it. So if you do have questions or want to add to the conversation, please add it. Click on the chat form. Please notice the to form though. If you want to add it just to panelists and hosts, meaning people you just see on the screen, or if you want to add it to everyone, meaning everyone you don't see. That means you'll be sending it to everyone. Ranger Sean is going to be kind of going through the chat and keeping track of all the questions. And at the very end, he'll pop back on the screen and he will ask Ranger Patrick all of your questions going through. All righty. Now, my boring stuff is done. So without further babbling from me, let's welcome Ranger Patrick as he presents Pirate or Patriot. Woo!
Well, great. Thank you, Karen. I appreciate that intro. Very exciting for me to be with you virtually and in a professional capacity, being able to talk about pirates. So hopefully everyone can see the screen here with this, the famous N.C. Wyeth painting about piracy, about pirates. This is from Treasure Island. So I've done this program in a few different capacities, both as an in-person program, as a walking tour. And when I do an introduction, I like to ask people that when they imagine what a pirate looks like in their mind's eye, what a pirate looks like, what a pirate sounds like, they're usually coming up with a very specific kind of pirate, the pirate that we know from popular fiction, such as comic books. There's Captain Hook from Peter Pan, from various movies. There's Blackbeard's Ghost, Treasure Island, of course, the Pirates of the Caribbean movie, Errol Flynn movies. And then that's how I thought of a pirate back in 1986. That was my costume for Halloween that year as a 4-year-old. So, I mean, who doesn't like pirates? So when we're thinking about pirates, we're thinking about a very specific kind of pirate and a very specific kind of era in piracy. So pirates have existed since the ancient world, and pirates exist today. Piracy has never left us in terms of robbery on the high seas. But this very specific kind of pirate is endemic to an era. And that's what we might refer to as the golden age of piracy from 1690 to 1730, really focused in the Americas, specifically the Caribbean. Now, this is an English map, but what's interesting is it's showing the old Spanish words, the Caribbean being referred to as the North Sea and the Pacific as the South Sea. This era is notable for a number of things. But before getting to that, the word itself, pirate, it comes from a Latin origin, simply meaning a sea corsair, a sea robber. And the origin from that is the Greek word piran, which means to seize by force. So we think about pirates, we're thinking about those who are seizing by force. So simply sea robbers. But this era of piracy centered on the New World was more than just people taking things that didn't belong to them. It very much is a preview of the American Revolution decades later in the 1770s as an early schism between the New World and the Old World, and a desire to create a different kind of society in the New World, one that was far more equitable socially, economically, politically, and even racially, usually on a very small scale, usually centered maybe on one pirate vessel. But these pirate vessels, being led by very colorful figures, were very small floating democracies. And they exemplified this desire among people from Great Britain, from Ireland, those who'd been born in America, sometimes those who had been enslaved from Africa, to create a different society free from the constraints of the old world. And a lot of the elements that influence this explosion of piracy in this very brief 4-decade period will later come to fruition on a much larger scale during the American Revolution. To put things in perspective in terms of how widespread piracy was in this era, by 1716, half of all the ships leaving from Cuba or Hispaniola, which is today the Dominican Republic and Haiti, were being seized by pirates. And in fact, by 1720, there was something like 2,000 active pirates in the Caribbean and along the eastern seaboard of North America. As much as it explodes, it then comes to kind of a crashing end by 1730. So let's discuss some of the elements that led to this explosion of piracy and this desire to create these alternative societies. So starting off with, you have the buccaneer period, and that's really the era that precedes the golden age of piracy. The buccaneer period is a little bit different. It does have elements that we would think about of pirates. Think about individuals like Henry Morgan, Sir Francis Drake before that. These pirates are not, or rather these buccaneers, and the term itself comes from an Arawak Indian word referring to a bucan or a grill for cooking and then later on drying meats. So a lot of these desperados, so to speak, supplemented their income from stealing by actually cooking meat and then selling it to ships that came by. These individuals were mostly land-based. These weren't pirate crews in the way that we think of them. They're mostly focused on the island of Tortuga, north of Hispaniola. And they made a lot of their that meat that I spoke of by actually hunting feral boars or feral cattle in what's now Haiti. But again, they were land-based. They're mostly focused only on Spanish targets. They aren't the pirate crews the way that we think of them later on, but that's the origin of the word buccaneer. And that's kind of the era that predates the golden age. Now let's get into some of the elements that influence this golden age. What leads to this explosion of piracy? And in particular, it's really the death of this individual here, Charles II of Spain. He is the last Habsburg monarch of Spain, and the heir to its enormous global empire. The problem with Charles II is that he is the product of inbreeding, meaning he has a lot of genetic deficits. He dies in his 30s after living a life of great illness, sickness. He's never able to produce any heirs. He could barely make himself understood in life, could barely even chew his own food. And at his death, there was going to be a power struggle in Europe for control of Spain's empire. And on one side, you have Bourbon France allied with the Bourbon heirs in Spain who want the Spanish throne, and the Habsburg Spanish who have their allies in Portugal, Austria, and Great Britain. So upon his death, there was going to be a global war known as the War of the Spanish Succession, in terms of who would succeed Charles II on the Spanish throne. And was known in the Americas as Queen Anne's War. So usually whatever war is going on in Europe, whoever was the monarch in England or the Great Britain later on will lead its name to the Americas. So you have King William's War, which was known in Europe as the War of the Grand Alliance or the 9 Years' War. You have the War of the Spanish Succession, Queen Anne's War, and then later on, what was known as King George's War here. So Queen Anne is the last of the Stuart line of English monarchs. She is the last Queen of England before the Act of Union in 1707, which then leads to the unification of Scotland and England as the United Kingdom. And upon her death at the very end of this war in 1714, you have George I as the King of Britain. And he is the grandfather of George III, of course, king during the American Revolution. And so he is the beginning of the Hanoverian line of British monarchs. Because of the law of succession, no Catholics could become the King of Britain. So Queen Anne's half-brother, George III, known as the Great Pretender, is kind of the influence behind the various Jacobite rebellions that occur in 1715 and also in 1745. A lot of the pirates are going to have a Jacobite influence where they are rejecting the Hanoverian line of British monarchs, rejecting them because of their German background, because of their Protestant background. So part of their rebellion in the Americas is partially to affect a change in the British government, which is not successful. Now, before Queen Anne's death, during the War of the during the War of the Spanish Succession, is that she will enable privateers to operate in the Americas. Now, what's the difference between privateer and pirate? So a privateer is operating under a letter of marque, essentially authorization from a government, and that can be a royal letter of marque. It could be issued by various colonial governors. The seizure of enemy ships to be seized as prizes, with usually a percentage of the prize money going back to whoever authorized that letter of marque, whether it's a colonial governor or whether that's a monarch. During this particular war, Queen Anne will actually take away this percentage, which normally was about 10%. So whatever privateer is operating under a letter of marque at the service of Great Britain or its colonies, whatever it seizes, it can take. So most pirates are beginning as privateers, operating under a letter of marque, which is normally a legal fig leaf. And we'll get into some of the issues, the problems with a letter of marque, as some pirates will discover. But after war's conclusion, they will simply continue their operations knowing how profitable it was. Another reason for piracy is, of course, extreme poverty in Great Britain. So in this era, about 20% of the population controlled about 80% of the wealth. So there's a lot of poverty. This particular engraving from the 1750s, known as Gin Lane, is showing the problems in Great Britain with poverty, often influenced by substance abuse, in this case, gin. That is also doubled with a post-war recession in Great Britain. So when the war ends in 1714, which ends with Philip of Anjou from France on the Spanish throne as the first Bourbon king of Spain, but renouncing all claims to the French throne. So there's not a kind of a super state between France and Spain. When the war ends, Britain's navy, which has more or less gone bankrupt fighting this incredibly expensive war, more or less mothballs for a period of about 2 years. And about 3/4 of its 36,000 sailors are then put out of work. So if one was serving on a British warship, war is over, they no longer have a job. And so now that society has this massive influx of unemployed sailors, normal merchant vessels can cut their cost in terms of hiring a sailor by about 50%. So normal wages are slashed appreciably. Now, a sailor at the best during this era could maybe hope to accumulate about 11 pounds per year. So in fact, a farm laborer could actually make more money. So sailors are not paid very well at all during this period. There's simply too many of them to go around. Many of them cannot find a living wage at all. So that's going to be tempting when it comes to making a change to become a pirate, because on average, a pirate could conceivably make up to 1,000 pounds in a very short period of time. That's more money than they could make over any 3 lifetimes as a normal sailor. Another reason for piracy comes from bitterness over impressment. So coming in this post-war period, Britain's Navy has enormous manpower needs. It simply needs sailors to man all these warships. And in order to get the sailors necessary, many people are forced, or rather pressed, into service. The problem with those who are pressed into service is that for most of them, it is a death sentence. Again, about 3/4 of all sailors pressed into service are dead within 2 years from combat, from disease, from maltreatment. So those who have survived this war are incredibly embittered by this experience, to have been forced into service, to have survived, and now to be out of work. To show actually what a contentious issue impressment was, before the Boston Tea Party or the Stamp Act riots in Boston, there was actually an earlier riot in 1747 when Commodore Charles Knowles of the British Navy comes into Boston and impresses about 46 sailors. More or less, he asks them if they have any verification of proof that they live in Boston. And of course, many sailors do not have that sort of proof that they actually reside here, traveling from one port to another. So they are forced into the Navy. And this prompts a reaction where the Royal Navy sailors and government officials are actually held captive by angry mobs. And it's such an issue that then Governor Shirley calls out the colonial militia to deal with this mob violence, except that the militia does not come out to serve Governor Shirley, and in fact, chase him out to Castle Island off of what's now South Boston. So this shows as early as 1747 that the government could not rely on the militias in Massachusetts, as will come into play during the American Revolution, but also what a contentious issue that impressment was. And eventually Commodore Knowles is forced to release those that he had impressed into service. Now, ironically, many pirate crews, when they capture a ship as a prize, will thus force some of those sailors and impress them into service. So they will inflict upon others what had been inflicted upon them. So if one was captured by authorities and accused of being a pirate, if you could prove somehow that you had been pressed into service, that might be a way to get out of being executed. Another common lament for many of those who are accused of piracy is severe punishments by ship captains. The harsh discipline at sea, which would have included flogging with either a tarred piece of rope or the cat of nine tails. And many captains had great latitude when it came to enforcing, very severe and sometimes lethal punishment to their crews. Another reason to become embittered and to kind of overthrow that power of captains. As we'll see with pirate crews, many of them have a far more egalitarian relationship with ship captains that's not prevalent in merchant captains, who could be far more abusive. There's also a number of natural disasters that lead to piracy, and that includes the destruction of Port Royal in Jamaica in June of 1692. It's a massive earthquake that more or less sinks this town, which at the moment, at that era, was the largest British seaport in the Americas. The destruction of Port Royal leads to really the rise of Boston. And that's really our center, our focus today. Piracy as influenced in Boston, because many pirates came here, many pirates were married here, many pirates were executed here or sold their goods here. Boston's wealth was built upon trade, and with the destruction of Port Royal, that trade will become focused here. So Boston is a major place for selling illicit goods. And when we think about what pirates are actually selling, rarely is it gold, plunder, jewels, things of that nature. It's primarily commodities. If you're a pirate crew, what you want to do is steal things that you can sell elsewhere. Timber, rum, sometimes enslaved people, cotton, indigo, silks. Those are the things that will be offloaded in a place like Boston and sold to a very willing population here, or in a place like New York City, Charleston, South Carolina, often with the express permission of the royal governors. Another kind of final natural disaster is the destruction of the Spanish treasure fleet in July 31st of 1715. About 11 ships are sunk just off the coast of Florida, about 1,000 men drowned, and over 7 million pesos will be lost in water that's no more than 30 feet deep. So 1715, you're going to see a massive interest here in New England of those heading down to Florida, the Caribbean, looking for that treasure. Actually, Spanish authorities are able to recover most of it. But that's a natural disaster that leads to a lot of interest at that moment in piracy. Spain, of course, although it's coming off of really being the dominant power in the Caribbean, and Britain's coming more on the rise, there's a massive amount of goods going through the Caribbean that's going to draw all this attention to all this trade, whether that is in timber, whether it's in silver. Spain's wealth came from the silver mines in Peru, which then had to be moved overland over Panama, where the Panama Canal is now, and then sent on these massive galleons to Europe. So all sorts of enticements to grab illicit goods in the Caribbean. The first pirate I'm going to address is Thomas Tew, and he is really the guy who sets the template for other pirates. He's born in 1649, either in Britain or in Rhode Island. It's not entirely clear. And during the 9 Years' War from 1688 to 1697, known as King William's War in North America, he has a letter of marque from the governor of Bermuda to attack French targets in West Africa. Well, once his ship, the Amity, is in the Atlantic, he proposes a radically different course of action, and that's to sail to the Red Sea and attack ships from the Mughal Empire. And his crew agrees with them, and they rally around him by saying a gold chain or a wooden leg will stand with you, meaning we'll either become extremely rich or we might pay a price for it. Now, that's also telling in that most pirate crews operated more or less with a reimbursement plan should you lose a limb, whether it was an arm, a leg, whether you lost an eye. There was some sort of restitution made with the share of prize money, so that no one would be left destitute and crippled without some sort of recompense. In 1693, Tew's ship sails into the Red Sea. They capture a Indian ship, again, Jadao, which is a wooden ship. It was carrying quite a bit of treasure, and Tew himself is able to gain about 8,000 pounds sterling for himself. Now, at that point, he proposes attacking other vessels, but his crew overrules him. And that's a distinction when it comes to the difference between pirate crews and merchant captains, in that the crews had quite a bit of influence over what course of action a pirate ship could take, especially the position of the quartermaster, usually the second in command. So Tew is overruled. He returns back to the East Coast. In this particular picture by Howard Pyle, he's enjoying a smoke with the then royal governor of New York, Benjamin Fletcher, who served as governor of New York until about 1797 and was more than willing to accept illicit goods. So there's sort of a corrupt bargain made between most pirate captains and the royal governors of different colonies, who, again, more than willing to accept illegal goods. The Navigation Acts that Britain established in the 1650s were supposed to control and regulate trade between North America and Great Britain, and they're mostly ignored during a period of what was known as salutary neglect. Governors, again, they're making their money on smuggling. Later on in the 18th century, John Hancock, we know him as one of the founding fathers, also involved with smuggling. It's not really until the 1760s that Britain really tries to crack down on this. Prior to that, royal governors more than willing to accept illegal goods. Well, too, was kind of thirsty for more. This one attack was not quite enough. So in 1694, he sets sail again for the Red Sea. And when he arrives at the Red Sea in 1695, there's quite a few other pirates there waiting, following his example. Now, in this case, he is not successful on his second voyage, and he is disemboweled by a cannon shot, so dying in August of 1695. But his example will be followed by others. So he's, again, setting the template for those to come. This is believed to be his flag. We always think about flags, the Jolly Roger, being important to pirates. The term itself, Jolly Roger, it's hard to know the exact origin. It probably comes from the French term Joli Rouge, meaning pretty red, a red flag indicating no quarter. The skull and crossbones emblem will be associated with other pirate captains, but it's a lot of guesswork in terms of what their flags actually looked like. There's a lot of kind of false flags out there about what pirates flew what. A number of pirates referred to their flag either as Old Roger or as Jolly Roger, although the pirates that did refer to their flags as the Jolly Roger, their designs are not what we think of a Jolly Roger today, that skull and crossbone. The person who will really follow the template of Thomas II is Henry Avery, or Avery. It's hard to know the exact spelling of his last name, really known as King of the Pirates. So he is one of the pirates waiting for Thomas II at the entrance to the Red Sea, ready to attack. He had experience actually in the Royal Navy during the 9 Years' War. He becomes a privateer, actually with a letter of marque from Spain. Initially, his ship, the Charles II, named after that ill-fated monarch, is waiting really for their orders and eventually become too impatient and decide to head off on their own to the Red Sea. In the engagements with ships from the Mughal Empire going to the Ottoman Empire, he is somewhat more successful than Thomas II, and who was killed. He actually seizes a massive ship called the Ganji Sawa in September of 1795, probably the largest single prize ever seized by an individual pirate captain, probably about 600,000 pounds sterling. A ship that was heading with pilgrims to Mecca. And with his crew of no more than 40 men, he's able to overpower this much larger ship, which had a crew of about 400. So with all this loot, he sails actually to the Bahamas, then a colony of Great Britain, governed by a royal governor, Nicholas Trott. And Henry more or less tries to pay him off. This is really one of the few examples of a pirate seizing a massive amount of plunder. I mentioned most pirates are after basic commodities. The problem, as exemplified by Avery when it came to stealing all this plunder, is that it brings a lot of unwanted attention to yourself. Once you have all of this illicit money, how do you then dispose of it in a way that doesn't draw attention to yourself? Because the Mughal Empire was, of course, extremely incensed that this English captain had attacked one of their key ships, pilgrims to Mecca. This will cause a lot of problems between the empire and the East India Company, Britain's East India Company. It's going to make trade between Britain In India, very dicey. So now Every has a lot of unwanted attention. Everyone's now looking for him and this plunder. So the question is, how do you then divest yourself of it in a way that you're not caught? It seems in the case of Every, he more or less gives his ship as a bribe to Governor Trott, but is not able to receive any sort of royal pardon. His crew goes their separate ways, and Every himself returns to Britain with kind of the captain's share. Now, when it came to divvying up a prize among privateers, the difference between privateers and pirates, and it's really Every who begins the example, is that he can claim no more than 2 shares. Privateer and captain could claim a large number of shares, because most pirate crew members are only able to get 1 share. Every limits himself to 2 shares, so he's not getting that much more share of the prize than the rest of his crew. In his case, it was primarily diamonds. He makes a mistake of probably trusting the wrong people when it came to fencing these diamonds, who more or less leave him in the lurch. So when he dies, probably in 1714, the thought is he died with less money than it would take to bury him with. So it showed the danger of seizing really lucrative prizes and then figuring out a way to divest yourself of that loot. Anyway, here is Every's flag, kind of more of the traditional Jolly Roger. I should mention, though, when he does die in 1714, most people actually don't know of his death. The thought was he was living as a king in Madagascar. And so pirates, when they want to follow an example of what one could achieve in a lifetime of piracy, he's the person they want to follow. And it's his notoriety that will influence the next set of pirates, which is Captain William Kidd. That name is probably familiar to a lot of you. And I like these 2 images because they show kind of 2 different sides of Kidd. One on the left, the Howard Pyle picture of Kidd burying treasure, looking like the arch pirate captain. On the right, a more respectable gentleman. And the question is really, which one was Kidd? Was he a pirate? Was he someone who tried to do his best but was sort of condemned by bad luck? I mentioned the earlier individuals too, and Every, though they don't really have a connection to Boston, and Kidd does, they're the reason why Kidd comes into prominence. So briefly about Kidd, he's from Scotland, born in 1654. He is a privateer during the 9 Years' War. He has a letter of marque from the governor of Nevis, which is a Caribbean island. And he mostly takes action against French and Spanish privateers off the coast of New York and makes a very good name for himself. And when he decides to settle in New York, it's in the upper echelons of society. He marries very well. He marries one of the wealthiest women in the colony, still in her 20s, but twice widowed, Sarah Ort. He is one of the founding members of Trinity Church in Manhattan, which still exists. He had his own pew there. So he's very much a respected member of society. In fact, he had been given a prize, about 150 pounds, for his service during the 9 Years' War. In late 1695, December of 1695, he travels to Great Britain. And while there, he meets up with the next forthcoming governor of New York, Richard Coote, the Earl of Bellamy, who's taking over from Benjamin Fletcher. Fletcher, who, as I mentioned, met up with Thomas too, is seen as being a bit too corruptible. So he'll be replaced by Richard Coote, who eventually will become both the governor of New York, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire, more or less simultaneously. And someone like him, who has connections to British Parliament, has been hearing the rumblings coming from India that English pirates are really making a nuisance of themselves. And what better person to take down a pirate crew than someone who knew a bit of the pirate world, a privateer, someone like William Kidd. So he more or less presents Kidd with an offer he can't refuse, which is to track down Henry Every and others, and Thomas too. People did not know that too was dead at this point, to track them down to kind of bring them to justice and to seize whatever treasure they had and bring it back to Great Britain. The backers behind this venture are other members of Parliament and also King William himself. So this is a letter of marque that is given to Kidd, not from a governor of a small island or kind of a backwater colony. This is coming directly from the king himself. So there is a lot of pressure now placed upon Kidd. So again, it's an offer really he can't refuse. So the backers organize the ship called the Adventure Galley. This ship in this picture, it's not the Adventure Galley, it's one very similar, a sailing ship, but a galley, one that had oars. So William Kidd thinks, okay, he's going to sail to the Indian Ocean, going to try to find these pirates, take whatever illicit treasure they've had, bring it back to Great Britain. But bad luck plagues him more or less from the very start. Inexplicably, as the Adventure Galley is rowing down the Thames, the ship failed to properly salute a British warship, which then fires a cannon across her bows, more or less to tell her, hey, show us some respect. Instead of giving the proper respect due this British warship, the crew of the Adventure Galley promptly moons this warship, which means that most of them are then instantaneously impressed into the Royal Navy, whether they wanted to it or not. So now Captain Kidd has to sail across the Atlantic to New York with a very undersized crew. He's lost most of his key crew members. As a result, has to do new recruiting in New York among people that he neither knows nor trusts, who might come from a somewhat more illicit background. And his problems with his crew, as exemplified early by that mooning incident, will plague him for the rest of the journey. So he's able to leave New York in 1696. He's going to go around the Cape Horn, South Africa, but issues continue to plague him. A number of the crew die of cholera. The ship turns out to be very leaky and needs a lot of repairs. And the pirates that Kidd is looking for are no longer present. To himself is dead. The problem that Kidd faces when it comes to his crew becoming more and more irritated with his conduct is that as a privateering vessel, the crew are not paid a normal wage like the crew of a merchant vessel or even a warship. They are paid in the shares of the prize. However, if no prize is seized, then nobody gets any money. So as long as Kidd fails to attack anybody, after a 3-year voyage, it's conceivable that as a sailor, you would go home with nothing to show for it. This crew that Kidd does not trust are now trying to pressure him more and more to attack any vessel that came their way and seize that as a prize. And Kidd is resisting as much as he can, but his crew is becoming more irritated. And one of them, a gunner called Richard Moore, it really ticks off Captain Kidd. And Kidd refers to him as a lousy dog. And Moore responds, if I'm a dog, then you have made me so. All of this tension building up, this is actually October 30th of 1797. So Kidd has been away from home for quite a while. All this tension builds up to an explosion of anger, and Kidd hurls a bucket at Moore's head, which cracks his skull, and Moore then perishes. So as I mentioned, a captain had a lot of latitude when it came to disciplining his crew, including flogging, but out and out murder was a little bit more difficult, and this will really come back to haunt Kidd. So now he knows that he has to put out this potential mutiny somehow. The crew is no longer on his side. They've seen what he has done. So eventually Kidd gives into pressure. And 2 months after the death of Moore, on January 30th of 1698, they come across a ship called the Quita Merchant, and they decide to seize it as a prize. The question was the Quita Merchant a legitimate target? So here's where things get confusing. The Kita merchant was owned by Armenians. It was piloted by a British captain. It was going from India to the Ottoman Empire. So it is primarily a Mughal ship, but it has passes from the French East India Company. So does all that together make this a legitimate target for Kidd? As I mentioned, his letter of marque only specifies the pirates that he's after, but he also has a letter of reprisal that allows him to attack French vessels. So he will use this idea that the ship he attacked had passes from the French East India Company, again, as more or less an excuse for seizing it. Quickly, though, Kidd finds out that he is a wanted man. In 1698, there is a general pardon issued by Great Britain for pirates. And there'll be similar such pardons throughout the golden age of piracy. This one's issued on December 8th of 1698, more or less offering clemency for pirates who have acted east of South Africa and was known as the Pirate Round, with two major exceptions, Henry Every and Captain Kidd. So Captain Kidd realizes, okay, he's now really in dire straits. He's wanted by the very government that sent him on his mission, because he's now become somewhat of an embarrassment. He's now in fact, a political liability, that the people who have backed him in Parliament are now realizing that he's making them look bad, and their opponents in Parliament are now using Kidd against them. So Kidd quickly switches ships. He transfers all his wealth to the Kita merchant, which he then names the Adventure Prize. He sails it to the Caribbean, he ditches it there, and then he sails up the East Coast on his own. He's hoping that his friend, Richard Coote, who is now Royal Governor of New York, will maybe accept some illicit goods the same way that Benjamin Fletcher did, and maybe get him out of trouble. As a result, Kidd decides to bury about 14,000 pounds worth of goods on Gardiner's Island near Long Island. I should mention, this is probably the only example of actual pirate buried treasure. You know, that's part of the mythology, the lore of pirates. This is probably the only example where it actually happened. And Kidd's hoping to use this more or less as an insurance to maybe get himself out of trouble, that he could point out to a bribable authority where they could pick up that 14,000 pounds. Richard Coote, first Earl of Bellamont, who's now the Royal Governor, decides that Kidd's best used as a sacrificial lamb. And he lures him to Boston, more or less promising that they'll work something out together. So Kidd comes here to Boston in 1699, and on July 6th of that year, he is promptly arrested and placed in the Boston prison, then known as Prison Lane, near what's now Court Street. If you look at this image, you're going to see a small image, kind of where the hand is pointing, of the original Boston Old Townhouse, which does not exist anymore, now being replaced by the Old State House. So that was the location of Boston's original prison until about 1822. A number of witches, pirates, Quakers, and newspaper editors who irritated authorities were imprisoned there. From 1699 to 1700, Captain Kidd is imprisoned here in Boston, again, a stone's throw away from where the Old State House is now, more or less in solitary confinement. The problem for him is there cannot be a trial for him here in Boston. The crimes he is allegedly to have committed are a violation of admiralty law. Admiralty law is not trial by jury, which existed then in Massachusetts, and admiralty law did not extend to Boston. So he has to be extradited back to Great Britain to stand trial. And that will eventually occur finally in 1700. He will have his trial in Britain, again, after spending almost a year in solitary confinement. And a number of his former crew members are now testifying against him for clemency. What Kidd hopes will exonerate him are the French passes from the French East India Company to show that his seizure of the key to merchant was in fact legitimate. However, when it comes to the trial, those passes go missing. They are not presented as evidence during the trial. And only the last few decades, in fact, have been rediscovered. So Kidd is put on trial for both murder, for the murder of Moore, the gunner, and for piracy. And he is convicted of both. Kidd believes that he is completely innocent. In fact, he will say on his own behalf that, "My lord," when he is sentenced to death, "My lord, it is a very hard sentence. I'm the most innocent of them all, but the witnesses have perjured themselves." Nonetheless, he is sentenced to death. And he is in fact executed on the 23rd of May, 1701, on Execution Dock in Wapping by the River Thames. Now, this was a major spectacle, as most pirate executions were. So probably thousands were in attendance. As he is led to the gallows, in front of him, someone would have carried a silver oar to show the power of the Admiralty. That was their sign, the silver oar. When actually he is hanged, the rope breaks and he drops to the ground, meaning he has to be strung up a second time. His body was then washed by 3 successive tides, which was a tradition when it came to pirates. So usually the execution occurred between the high tide watermark and the low tide watermark. And as this image shows, he is then essentially tarred and gibbeted. His body is put on display for at least 3 years as a warning to others not to follow in his footsteps. Similar things will happen in Boston, as we'll later discuss. Now, as early as 1701, right after his execution, Kidd already passed into popular lore. So even in their lifetime, pirates were already becoming the stuff of popular fiction, popular folklore, and mass media. And these are, in fact, the lyrics to the Ballad of Captain Kidd. You can find this actually sung on YouTube. And we'll reference the burying the Bible. And this will become a common artistic motif when it came to depicting Kidd. We're going to went to his grave thinking that he probably was innocent of piracy, but someone who was caught up by a lot of different elements. So he would be an example, as much as Henry Avery was an example to other pirates about what they could achieve in their lifetime with a little bit of daring. Kidd proved that you should not put your trust always in authorities. That if you're going to be a pirate all the way. Don't think that some sort of legal fig leaf as a letter of marque or passes from a foreign entity will somehow exonerate you. Now, I mentioned Captain Kidd was not executed in Boston because at that time Admiralty law did not extend to Massachusetts. So in fact, the first pirate to be executed here would be a man known as John Quelch. And Quelch, who was born about 1666, like most of other pirates, begins as a privateer who actually has his letter of marque from the governor of Massachusetts, John Dudley, in 1703, to attack, again, Spanish and French vessels. Quelch himself is probably the first mate of a ship, again, that leaves from Marblehead in probably the fall of 1703. But once they reach the high seas, they mutiny. A common trope of these pirate captains. They are the result of mutiny. The captain of his ship and probably a number of the ship's officers are first imprisoned and then put to death, and Quelch is elected to be captain. They decide to start attacking Portuguese vessels off the coast of Brazil, Brazil then being a Portuguese possession. Unknown to them, in 1703, Portugal had come on the side of Great Britain in the War of the Spanish Succession. So unknowingly, he in fact was attacking the allies of the country he was supposed to be, the power he was supposed to be representing. Now, somewhat illogically, Quelch decides to then return to Marblehead with about 10,000 pounds of sterling of gold dust. Within a week, he is arrested, imprisoned, and now because of Admiralty law does extend to Massachusetts, he and others are sentenced to death. Again, the trial occurs at the old townhouse, very close to where Captain Kidd was imprisoned. After his sentence, he is paraded through Boston's North End. Again, a silver oar was carried in front of him. And at that time, the place of execution was where the Converse factory is now, very close to Boston Garden. If you know where, of course, the bridge construction going on now, you probably have seen the Converse shoe factory. That's where the old Charlestown Ferry was, and that's where the gallows would have been erected. Now, another figure in this execution, which occurs in June of 1704, is Cotton Mather. And Cotton Mather, who was a minister of the original North Church in Boston, not the old church as we know it today, which was then known as Christ Church. Mather, of course, would become very prominent, or had already become prominent due to his participation in the Salem witch trials. He's a bit of an oddity because he's someone who is both a man of science. He very much was a proponent of inoculation against diseases like smallpox in the 17th century, which was quite controversial. But he's also a believer in spectral evidence. So he's very much instrumental in the execution of a number of people, both in Salem and also in Boston. In fact, as early as 1685, he's seeing a Catholic woman put to death, more or less for the crime of Catholicism. But he is someone who is very much influenced or interested in piracy. And he's seeing the actions of pirates as kind of destroying this idea of this puritanical utopia in Massachusetts, the idea of the city on a hill, a society that would be holy and sacrosanct. The actions of pirates are anathema to that. So at most pirate trials, he will come to more or less harass and harangue whoever is on trial, and then to make some sort of publication about it afterwards. And gives himself a lot of credit. One of his interesting lines is, "We have told you often, we have told you weeping, that your sins have been many and almighty, and the sins for which you now are to die are of no common aggravation." So quite a little bit full of himself. So he'll be present at most of the pirate trials to come. Now, at Quelch's execution in the North End, there are a few folks who are spared, hence the public interest in seeing an execution. It's not just about someone being killed, but it's about the singing of hymns. It's about those who are trying to take back what they've done, and those who are then granted a reprieve. One of those executed along with John Quelch, a man called Lambert, he is not given a reprieve. He is in fact put to death. However, his family is able to dig up his body and rebury it by here in Boston. In fact, at King's Chapel. So it's, and presumably the body is still there today. And he'll be one of the individuals who referred to his flag as Old Roger. Probably the most prominent pirate, one of the unsung pirates of this era, is Black Sam Bellamy. And very quickly, this is probably, we don't know whether this is the best depiction of Black Sam Bellamy, but this is from Wiki Commons. I understand I'm being somewhat pressed for time, so let me wrap up some of this a little bit quickly. But he's probably the most prominent pirate of his era. Born in Britain, serves during the War of the Spanish Succession. Later on travels to Massachusetts, lives in Boston between 1713 and 1715, probably falls in love with a woman from Cape Cod. Probably impregnates her, but can't make himself a good suitor due to the lack of money. He hears about the wreck of the Spanish treasure fleet, and him and her friend Palsgrave Williams decide to try their luck and go down to the Caribbean, falling into the hands of pirates, deciding to become pirates themselves, including men like Benjamin Hornigold and Benjamin Hornigold's sidekick, William Tetch, better known as Blackbeard. So after the war has ended, they are continuing to attack Spanish targets, and other individuals are wanting to attack all targets, not just Spanish vessels. Some individuals like Hornigold are against the idea, but William, like Bellamy, are all for it, and they decide to become pirates on their own, more or less declaring themselves free princes. If we have this idea of pirates being kind of the glamorous swashbucklers, Bellamy is the one who really fits that mark. His key ship is called the Ouida Galley. It's a slave ship that he captures in February of 1717. Probably the most powerful pirate ship of its era. And there's its flag. However, it's wrecked off the coast of Cape Cod in a storm in April of 1717. Almost all of his crew perishes. Only a few men were able to make it to shore. They will stand trial at the old State House, as we know it today. 9 men, the only 9 survivors from his ship and another ship called the Mary Ann that was kind of following in his wake. 9 men are accused of piracy. Only 6 are convicted. 2 men are able to prove that they were impressed. Another, John Julian, a Mosquito Indian, is sold as a slave to the grandfather of John Quincy Adams. The ship itself, the Ouida Merchant, was actually discovered in 1984. If you go to the Pirate Museum in Yarmouth, you would see some of that some of the elements that have been recovered from that ship on display. Quickly, when it comes to Blackbeard, when Blackbeard hears that the crew members from Bellamy of course perished when his ship went down, only about 28 years old, but in his lifetime had accumulated about $150 million of currency in today's currency. He proposes potentially attacking Boston. It's not an idle threat because, in fact, in 1718, he will blockade Charleston, South Carolina. He enters into somewhat of an illicit pact with the corruptible governor of North Carolina, Charles Eden, who will actually oversee Blackbeard's wedding. Blackbeard will accept the king's pardon in 1718, but it's more or less a ruse. There was a pardon issued in 1718 granting clemency to pirates. Blackbeard accepts it, but decides to not follow along. He goes to Bath, North Carolina. He keeps on attacking other ships. He brings them into North Carolina and claims that they were derelict on the high seas, more or less so he can split up the proceeds between himself and the royal governor. This irritates the lieutenant governor of Virginia, who then sends a small fleet of ships to chase down Blackbeard and more or less invade a different colony. Blackbeard meets his end on the 22nd of November, 1718 in battle, receiving no less than 5 pistol shots and 20 cutlass strikes before being decapitated and his head brought back to Williamsburg, Virginia. Allegedly, his head may have been turned into a goblet and end up somewhere in potentially at the Peabody Essex Museum, although chances are it's not likely. Quickly, when it comes to the pirate code, this is what all the men are operating off of. Men like Bellamy, men like Blackbeard, which is that every man has an equal vote and access to food and drink, equal vote when it comes to electing ship's officers or captains. Prize money has to be split and must be made accountable. You can't have any sort of secret treasure. So there's the man kind of divvying up the goods. Desertion in battle is punishable by death or marooning. Weapons have to be kept ready. Despite the popular depiction, there in fact was no walking the plank, no gambling on board, lights out at 8 p.m., no women on board, although there will be women pirates, no fights at sea, that disputes have to be settled ashore. You cannot leave your crew into pirate crew until you've accumulated about 1,000 pounds sterling. And that the most a captain or a second in command or quartermaster could receive was 2 shares. Other officers, 1.5 or 1.25. For your basic pirate, the shares will be 1. So there's not a great discrepancy in terms of the amount of plunder a captain versus the rest of the crew could receive. So again, far more equitable than merchant vessels. I mentioned no women on board. There were 2 women who were convicted of piracy during this golden era. One is Mary Read, who lives most of her life as a man, both as a as a kind of a footman, as a soldier fighting in the War of the Spanish Succession. Before traveling to the Caribbean, meeting up with some other pirates, including Calico Jack Rackham and more or less his partner, Anne Bonny. The women mostly live their lives as men. Their actual gender is not known to the other crew members. And they were, I guess, as deadly with a sword as any others. They will eventually, in fact, be captured in November of 1720 and brought to trial in Spanish Town in Jamaica. However, both women pled their bellies, meaning they were both pregnant, so they could not be put to death. However, it does seem that Mary Read perished of illness in April of 1721, and Anne Bonny more or less falls out of history, disappearing sometime around 1733, potentially dying in the Carolinas. These are the only two women being convicted of piracy during this era. Now, Boston did have female pirates. One was Rachel Wall, who is in fact married to a former privateer from the American Revolution. And between 1781 and 1782, more or less use a ruse in New Hampshire where they lure ships to them by claiming some distress and then attacking them. Kind of in a case of the boy who cried wolf. In fact, in a storm, their pirate ship does sink. Rachel Wall is the only one who survives. She returns to Boston, lives her life as a servant, however, attacks a woman over a bonnet that she wanted to steal, is convicted of attempted robbery, and then put to death in 1789 here in Boston, the last woman to be hanged in Boston. This is just a statue of those two women, Mary Read and Anne Bonny, by execution dock in Wapping in Great Britain. Edward Lowe is kind of the last guy in detail I'll talk about. If we think of Bellamy being this sort of romantic figure, someone who referred to himself as being a kind of the Robin Hood of the seas, Lowe was closer to a psychopath. Actually would have looked a bit like the Joker due to a botched surgery on his face. He lives in Boston from 1707 to 1722. He's married at the First Church of Boston. He has the employment as a ship's rigger. However, his wife dies soon after childbirth in 1719, and Lowe will go to Honduras to engage in the illicit trade of being a bayman, more or less gathering timber, not to be made into ships or houses, but to be sold for the inner bark for their dyes. However, in a dispute over a missing meal, Lowe decides to become a pirate, much like Bellamy declaring war against the whole world. There's his flag. And was more or less known for his intense cruelty, executing captives, including especially Spanish captives. The English always had a thing against the Spanish in the Caribbean. That goes back to their earlier conflicts, torturing torturing members of ships that he had captured, often threatening to boil them, cutting off their lips and cooking them. A real bad figure. And most of what we know about him comes from the accounting of a fisherman from Marblehead, Philip Ashton, who was captured along with other fishermen off Nova Scotia in 1722, pressed into service. Ashton will escape from the pirates in the Caribbean, living on a deserted island for about 16 months before able to return to Marblehead after being away for about 3 years. And from his accounts, we know the most about Lowe. He suffers a lot of punishment from the pirates because he refuses to sign the ship's articles, becoming one of their crew members. One of his friends does do that, and that's more or less used against him at a later on trial in Rhode Island. So here was someone impressed into service, decides the easiest thing is to sign the ship's articles, and that is his ultimate death sentence. So Ashton really has to prove that he was not a pirate along with guys like Lowe. But as I mentioned, pirate crews being very democratic, with pirates able to select their own captains, they could then more or less fire their own captains. And Lowe's crimes were of such severity and eventually such an irritation to the other crew members that they decide to depose him of being a captain. And he's potentially set adrift in 1724 before being picked up by French authorities and executed on Martinique. Maybe. We're not entirely sure of what happens to Lowe. He kind of falls out of history after 1724. So he shows that as cruel as he was, because individuals like Blackson Bellamy or even Blackbeard are not actually known to have killed anybody personally. Lowe absolutely did, but it shows the limitations of a pirate captain, that his crew could eventually depose him if they saw fit. William Fly is one of the last pirates to be executed in Boston. He just kind of shows the decline of piracy as we're getting into the 1720s. He's only a pirate for about 35 days. He is part of a mutiny, much like all of his other counterparts. He captures only about 5 ships in and around New England before captive crew members overpower him and bring him back to Boston for trial. And I just want to mention his execution occurred on Nix's Mate. If you've gone into the Harbor Islands, you've seen Nix's Mate. That's where Fly was executed in 1726. In fact, he insisted on tying the noose himself, presumably so he would die a swifter death. And this is where pirates will be both executed and gibbeted, including a former crew member of Blackbeard, John Rose Archer, who's executed there earlier in 1724. So if you were coming into Boston in the 1720s, you pass this particular spot, this is where you would see pirates being displayed, their bodies, as a warning to others. Well, what leads to the end of this golden age of piracy? One is the kind of the loss of their main hub in the Bahamas by Rhodes Rogers. A privateer himself becomes royal governor there, more or less kicking out the pirates and removing that as a base of operations. One is the proclamation by George I, this pardon for all crimes committed before January of 1718, although pirates will decide to accept that as their kind of get out of jail free card, and also just simply the attrition rate. By 1723, roughly 1,000 pirates have been executed. I mentioned in 1720, there were probably more than 2,000 active pirates in the Caribbean. By the time William Fly is killed in 1726, there's no more than 200. The last pirate trial in Boston is that of a Spanish pirate known by Pedro Gilbert, who attacked a ship bound from Salem to Rio de Janeiro. He is captured by British authorities. Also, by the way, his pirate ship was the Panda, not exactly striking terror into the hearts of his victims. He's extradited to Boston. He is imprisoned in the Leverett Street prison in 1835. And there, in fact, he is executed because he was Catholic. Most cemeteries will not accept him, except for St. Francis de Sales, the Catholic cemetery there at the top of Bunker Hill. So if you're passing over Bunker Hill, yes, there are pirates buried up there. One last pirate element, and that is Dungeon Rock. If you're in the town of Lynn, you might have passed Dungeon Rock. A local there in 1852 here in Marble believed that the ghost of a pirate was instructing him where buried treasure was. And with a pickaxe and dynamite, he excavated his own cave in what's now known as Dungeon Rock. Probably he was influenced by the publication of the Edgar Allan Poe short story, The Gold Bug, this idea of buried treasure. And Kidd is the only example we know of that. But more or less, this example shows how by the mid-19th century, piracy had really passed into lore. So in conclusion, the elements that led to the golden age of piracy are going to find a sequel in the later American Revolution. These pirate crews trying to find and establish different societies apart from Great Britain, where there was an equal share of treasure, where there was agency, where there was upward mobility, where there was more racial parity. And 30 to 40% of most pirate crews were of African descent. Many of them were also in positions of leadership, but they're all on a small scale. And so they don't succeed in establishing any sort of revolutionary change in the Americas or Great Britain, but all the issues that led to this era of piracy are what will lead on to and come to fruition in the American Revolution into the 1770s. So for that, I know I'm really running out of time, so I'm going to turn things over to Sean real quick to lead us out.
Great. So Patrick, I think we have time for I want to ask one question and then we can transition out of here. I know we are a little bit over time. So I wanted to ask, in your opinion, where is the most significant pirate landmark in Boston?
I would say, and where I've done this as a walking tour, the places, probably the three places, are really where the Converse factory is right now. And there's a restaurant right there. That's where the old Charleston Bridge is located. That's where the executions would have taken place. The old State House, because that's where the trials occurred for the crew members of Bellamy, and Nix's mate in Boston, part of the Boston Harbor Islands, where individuals like William Fly and John Rose Archer were executed. So those are really the three locations here that have that specific connection to piracy. And then the graveyard at the top of Bunker Hill. Those are the four locations. If you're looking to make a pilgrimage to either of those sites, those are the places to go to.
Great. Awesome. So I know that we do have a couple leftover questions here. More than happy to look at some of those, and we do have information that we can get those out to you. But do want to let everyone know that in 2 weeks, we do have our next BPL presentation, Patriots of Color, exploring the stories of African Americans who served during the American Revolution. So do come back for that. But other than that, I just want to say, speaking for everyone, thank you very much, Patrick. I'd say your knowledge of piracy in this area is definitely unmatched. And I hope that everyone has a wonderful evening. So thanks for taking some time with us, and thanks again to Patrick.